In the fading autumn of 1834, as the mist curled over Baltimore's inner harbor, a dock worker stumbled upon something that would shatter the illusion of American medical nobility. Beneath layers of salt, ice, and secrecy, deep in the hull of a Europe-bound cargo vessel, lay 17 human bodies. Each corpse bore surgical incisions not from crude butchery, but from the precise hand of a master anatomist. The shipping manifest labeled them innocently medical specimens, St. Thomas Medical University, Maryland. But what the worker saw wasn't science. It was personal. One of the bodies had a scar, a jagged crescent just beneath the ribs that he knew too well. It belonged to his nephew. The boy had supposedly died of fever while studying at that same prestigious Catholic medical school. But there was no fever. There was no illness, only betrayal. What unfolded next would uncover a 36-year conspiracy fueled by greed, murder, and the cold ambition of men in white coats. Behind the grand iron gates of St. Thomas, the Walsh family had transformed their sacred institution into the nation's most lucrative house of horrors, raking in the modern equivalent of $25 million by selling the dead to Europe's elite universities. Every cadaver in that ship's hold was a receipt, every stitch a ledger of human suffering. But this wasn't just about stolen bodies. It was about a system, a sanctified pipeline, from the sick wards of Maryland to the ivory towers of European medicine. And the rot ran deep. Before we dive further into the unholy empire built by the Walsh family, I want you to remember, this channel exists to reveal the darkest true stories buried beneath America's polished past. So, if these tales speak to something inside you, something curious, something haunted, subscribe, ring the bell, and tell me where you're watching from. I read every comment from our ever-growing circle of mystery seekers. Now, let's open the records of St. Thomas, where medicine was no longer about healing, but harvesting. Because what came next wasn't just scandal, it was revelation, the kind that stinks through history and demand. We ask, how many futures were cut open on the altar of progress? Earned barely $300 annually. But to these immigrant families, sending a son to St. Thomas wasn't just an investment, it was a holy calling. They believed their sons were stepping into a sacred lineage, a noble mission to heal bodies and elevate their communities. But behind the stone chapel walls and the Latin chants of morning mass, the Walsh family was cultivating something far darker than holy medicine. While other universities depended on stolen corpses from graveyards, often caught and publicly shamed, St. Thomas remained untouched by scandal. No missing persons reports, no desecrated cemeteries. Yet, their dissection tables were never empty. So where were the bodies coming from? As enrollment grew, so did the Walsh's need for anatomical material. And quietly a new system was born, one that didn't rely on ghoulish grave robbers, but something far more chilling, the very students themselves. It began with the weakest. Poor boys, orphan boys, boys with no family to ask questions if they vanished. If one of them fell ill during a semester, the story was always the same. Fever, consumption, infection. The body would be whisked away for Catholic burial, and the family, if they had one, was sent a sealed letter of condolence, often signed by all three Walsh doctors. But the truth was far more horrifying. Their remains never left the campus. Instead, their bodies became the semester's freshest lesson. The Walsh family had, in essence, transformed their university into a self-sustaining slaughterhouse, where the tuition of the living funded the dissection of the dead, and every classroom became a silent altar to greed and ambition, and no one dared question it. Until 1834. That's when one dock worker, haunted by the sight of his nephew's scar, blew open the coffin lid of an empire built not on knowledge, but on murder. Now, as we peel back the layers of the sinister institution, you'll discover how the holy mission of medicine was twisted into something monstrous, and how three brilliant minds, bound by blood, used God, science, and trust as weapons in one of the most horrifying conspiracies in American history. This is the legend of St. Thomas, and it's only just begun. Skills. But no one, not his roommates, not his professors, not even a local family who housed him, ever saw him again. University officials claimed he had returned home unexpectedly due to family matters, yet no letter ever came, and Patrick's family swore they hadn't heard a word. They wrote letters, visited local authorities, even made the long trip to Emmitsburg themselves, but received only vague reassurances and polite stonewalling. What few dared whisper, only behind closed doors, was that Patrick wasn't the first, nor would he be the last. Over the next decade, a quiet pattern unfolded at St. Thomas. Students, always poor, always male, and always nearing the end of their studies, would vanish without trace. Most had no families nearby to raise alarms. A few were dismissed as dropouts, others as homesick boys who abandoned their calling. And always, the university's response was the same: calm, professional, utterly devoid of concern. Yet, inside the anatomy lab, things were different. Faculty and students marveled at how Dr. James Walsh always had the freshest specimens, young, strong, unmarked by age or decay. Some joked grimly about the Walsh magic, unaware how close they were to the truth. Behind the bell tower, in the cold stone basement of the chapel, a door led to a locked chamber that no student was ever permitted to enter. Only Margaret, James, and Michael had keys. What lay behind it would remain hidden for nearly a century, until one rainy spring morning in 1882, when a pair of curious seminarians stumbled across what looked like a forgotten storage room. What they found inside would unravel the entire legacy of the Walsh Dynasty and reveal the dark heart pulsing beneath St. Thomas's sacred walls. Imagine working your whole life, saving every single penny, just to send your son to medical school, and then he vanishes without a trace. No warning, no goodbye. This is the real story of Patrick O'Brien, a 19-year-old dreamer from Boston who got accepted into one of the most elite and secretly twisted medical schools in America, St. Thomas Medical University. He was in his final month. He was so close to graduating. But one night in 1799, he walked into the anatomy lab and was never seen again. But let's rewind. Patrick had been struggling with his grades, but he wasn't giving up. He was determined to succeed. To catch up, he signed up for extra anatomy sessions with the brilliant but eerily intense Dr. James Walsh. That's when things got weird. His roommate, Thomas Mackenzie, said Patrick was acting off. He talked about hearing strange noises at night, whispers, metal scraping, crying, coming from the anatomy lab. And he was terrified of something called special procedures that Dr. Walsh had just started teaching behind closed doors. On May 15th, 1799, Patrick told Thomas, "Hey, I'm heading to the lab for a late-night study session." He left the room at 9 p.m. He never came back. The next morning, Thomas panicked. He reported Patrick missing. But guess who stepped in? Dr. Michael Walsh himself, the university president and head of the Walsh family. According to him, Patrick did go to the lab that night. But get this, he claims Patrick freaked out, had a nervous breakdown, and decided to quit school on the spot. He said Patrick left a note, grabbed some essentials, and took off for Boston, ashamed and heartbroken. Sounds believable, right? Except no one ever saw that note, not even his roommate, and the university refused to let anyone read it, including Patrick's own parents. 2 weeks later, Patrick's mom and dad showed up at the university. They were desperate. They hadn't heard a single word from their son. And what happened next is insane. They were greeted by Margaret Walsh, the co-founder of the school. She coldly repeated the same story. Patrick left. He was embarrassed. He didn't want anyone to contact you. But when his mother asked, "Can we at least see his things? His clothes, his books, anything?" Margaret replied, "Oh, I'm sorry. Patrick requested that everything he owned be donated to charity." It's all been given away. What? A father who gave up years of wages to fund his son's dream was now being told, sorry, he's gone, and so are his things. No answers, no trace, just a cold smile and a closed door. But this wasn't the last student to vanish at St. Thomas Medical University. And the deeper people dug into the Walsh family's secrets, the darker things became. Something evil was festering in the anatomy lab, and Patrick O'Brien may have been its very first victim. Patrick O'Brien had everything riding on his final exams. The pressure was intense. But then he vanished. His disappearance wasn't just strange, it was chilling. His roommate, Thomas Mackenzie, remembered how Patrick had been acting off. In the nights leading up to May 15th, he said he'd been hearing weird, unsettling noises coming from the anatomy lab. Not rats, not pipes, something else. And then there were the whispers, concerns about new procedures that Dr. James Walsh had recently introduced to his advanced students. No one knew exactly what those procedures involved, but Patrick was clearly disturbed by them. On May 15th, around 9 p.m., Patrick told Thomas he was heading out for a late-night study session in the lab. He never came back. The next morning, Thomas raised the alarm, and Dr. Michael Walsh, James's brother, took personal charge of the investigation. He told everyone that Patrick had shown up at the lab, but what happened? Next sounded more like a cover-up than the truth. Walsh claimed that Patrick had buckled under pressure, panicked during a gruesome anatomy lesson, and decided to quit medical school entirely. According to the story, Patrick had a mental breakdown, packed up his things, and left for Boston in the middle of the night. The university president backed it up, claiming that Patrick had left a handwritten note, one no one ever saw, begging the school not to tell his parents because he was ashamed. Dr. Walsh reassured everyone, it happens. Some students simply crack under pressure. But when Patrick's parents arrived 2 weeks later, everything unraveled. His mother demanded to see his belongings. His father, a hardened dock worker who had worked himself to the bone just to send his son to medical school, refused to believe Patrick would vanish without a word. But Margaret Walsh, the wife of Dr. James Walsh, Colby told him that Patrick had donated all his possessions to charity. And the letter? Destroyed. Patrick didn't want to face his family, she said. He was too ashamed. But Patrick's last letter to his parents said otherwise. He had written just days before, full of hope, energy, excitement about his future in medicine. The O'Briens knew something was horribly wrong. They tried to involve the local sheriff, William Hawkins. But Hawkins had dinner regularly with the Walshes. He smiled, nodded, and said he'd investigate thoroughly. He interviewed students. All repeated the same eerie line. Patrick had seemed troubled. Walsh even handed over documents showing Patrick's grades slipping in notes supposedly written by Patrick expressing doubt in his studies. But what the sheriff didn't find, or didn't want to find, was a horrifying truth. Patrick did go to the lab that night, but what he walked into wasn't a study session. It was a trap. Instead of textbooks and scalpels, Patrick was led through a secret door, hidden behind a bookshelf in Dr. James Walsh's private office, into a room that didn't exist on any blueprint, a hidden chamber deep beneath the university, a cold, silent lab. No windows, no clocks, no witnesses. And what happened next was unthinkable. Dr. Walsh called it a comprehensive practical exam, but it was anything but. He administered chloroform to Patrick, telling him it was part of a new teaching method, the kind used in elite European schools. This will prepare you for real surgery, he said. But it was a lie. The dose wasn't for practice. It was perfectly measured. To kill. Walsh had spent months refining the formula. He wanted a method that would shut down the lungs gently, without struggle. A death that looked like sleep. No one would question it. Patrick had unknowingly volunteered himself for a death disguised as science. And no one, not the students, not the police, not even his family, would ever see him again. They said he simply vanished. That one day, Patrick O'Brien, a bright-eyed medical student with a mind for healing, walked out of the university library and was never seen again. But the truth was far more chilling than a disappearance. It was the beginning of a quiet massacre, hidden beneath the polished floors of St. Thomas Medical University, where the scalpel and scripture were used not to save lives, but to harvest them. In the months that followed Patrick's disappearance, letters from the university continued to assure the O'Brien family that their son was pursuing his studies with dedication. Handwritten notes, later proven to be forgeries, described late-night dissections, complex lectures, and dreams of becoming a surgeon. But Patrick was already dead. His body was halfway across the Atlantic, embalmed to perfection and sold, like cattle to the highest bidder. And still no one suspected. Dr. James Walsh, with his tailored suits and priest-like calm, had perfected his role as both healer and executioner. By day, he taught the future physicians of America how to save lives. By night, he quietly took them. His basement laboratory, hidden behind a mahogany bookshelf, was more morgue than classroom, a place where science was used not to study death, but to produce it. Students were carefully selected, those without close family nearby, those whose grades had begun to slip, those who wouldn't be missed immediately. To each, Dr. Walsh offered a rare opportunity, an advanced anatomy session conducted privately. The honor was too tempting to refuse. And once inside the hidden chamber, each student was gently put to sleep, with a dose of chloroform calibrated not to numb, but to end, silently, without struggle. Walsh's preservation technique was second to none. His cadavers were not mere corpses. They were masterpieces, their tissues supple, their faces undisturbed, their internal organs intact. European universities, desperate for bodies and unbothered by the details, paid handsomely. The money flowed in. The murders continued. By 1892, rumors had begun to stir among the students. Whispers of classmates vanishing after visiting the professor's office. But fear and reverence kept lips sealed. Even when a janitor found dry blood beneath the floorboards of the anatomy wing, the matter was quietly dismissed as an animal specimen. Mishap. Over 3 decades, the Walsh family built a fortune and a legacy on this grim enterprise. 156 young men, all with names, families, dreams, reduced in numbered boxes in Edinburgh's lecture halls. Each disappearance explained with plausible lies, a mental breakdown, a sudden transfer, a tragic accident, no one could prove, but secrets rot. And beneath the stone corridors of St. Thomas, the stench was growing stronger, and eventually someone would smell it. By 1852, the Walsh family's operation was no longer a secret held between siblings, but a cold, systematic enterprise with every member playing a role. Dr. Michael Walsh, whose calm demeanor and polished charm masked a soul hollowed out by greed, became the financial brain behind it all. He traveled often, under the guise of attending medical conferences, but in truth, he was brokering deals with prestigious universities, London, Vienna, Berlin, and most lucratively, the University of Edinburgh. They paid handsomely for what he euphemistically called specimens of rare preservation. No questions asked. To his contacts overseas, Michael presented himself as a benevolent educator, sending bodies only of those who had donated themselves to science. But those who received the remains never knew that many of the young men had never signed any such document, never even imagined their bodies would sail across the Atlantic in crates filled with ice and lies. The money flowed steadily, fueling the expansion of St. Thomas Medical University. New buildings were constructed, laboratories grew, equipment gleamed with the promise of cutting-edge science. To the outside world, the Walsh family were pioneers in medicine, advancing the noble cause of human understanding. But beneath that polished veneer, in the cold silence of the basement chambers, they were harvesting lives. As the years passed, the operation grew in sophistication. The advanced study program had an application process, entrance interviews, even written recommendations, none of which ever reached the university board. They were all handled internally, quietly, by Margaret Walsh and her assistants, most of whom were completely unaware of the truth. Those who grew suspicious often resigned. A few were given lucrative opportunities elsewhere, bribes in the form of job offers, and the very few who pushed back disappeared entirely. Inside the walls of St. Thomas, the legend of students dropping out became routine. Professors shrugged. The administration offered condolences. But no one ever saw Patrick O'Brien again, nor did they see Thomas Blake, or Elijah Crane, or any of the 156 boys whose names slowly, quietly, and efficiently vanished from university records. But they lived on in a way. Their preserved bodies became teaching tools, sliced open under the bright gas lamps of Edinburgh's finest lecture halls. Fingers pointed, blades cut, applause echoed. Future doctors studied them, never knowing the true horror behind the flawless preservation. And so, the Walsh family's name became synonymous with brilliance in transatlantic medical circles. But at St. Thomas Medical University, whispers began to spread. Soft, fearful rumors spoken only in candlelit dormitories and drunken murmurs in town taverns. Some said you could hear voices echoing through the old lab at night. Some said the preserved corpses weren't always still. And some, just a few, believed the Walsh family sins had not been buried, only embalmed, waiting, silently, to be unearthed. The selection of victims followed a meticulous and chilling logic. Each name was weighed not just by circumstance, but by how easily it could be erased. Those with no father, or whose mother lived miles away on a quiet farm, were ideal. Those whose handwriting could be forged without question, whose grief-stricken parents might blame poverty or divine will for their absence. These were the names that made it to the top of Margaret Walsh's list. Over time, the Walsh family system became more refined. Disappearances were staggered across semesters, spaced just enough to avoid suspicion. Students were sometimes sent on fabricated research, sabbaticals, or religious retreats never to return. Others were said to have transferred to schools overseas, where follow-up was nearly impossible. No questions were asked. After all, these were the troubled ones, the poor souls who weren't cut out for medicine. James Walsh, with his surgeon's calm and a cleric's quiet demeanor, carried out the procedures in that subterranean lab. He worked late into the night under flickering oil lamps, humming Latin hymns as he preserved the dead with uncanny skill. His notes were coded, bound in leather journals, and stored in hollowed-out volumes of scripture, books that no one dared question. Michael Walsh, ever the diplomat, ensured that demand in Europe never faltered. He courted wealthy, benefactors and medical scholars alike, using Baltimore's Catholic ties as a trusted currency. The church, in return, looked the other way, grateful for the Walsh family's contributions to orphanages, food drives, and the construction of a new wing at St. Mary's Hospital. And so the operation continued year after year, a quiet harvest of flesh and bone, sanctioned by silence and cloaked in charity. St. Thomas Medical University rose in prestige. Scholars came from across the Atlantic to witness its innovative curriculum. No one knew that the price of progress lay buried in salt, ice, and sawdust in the ship holds of vessels bound for Europe. But in the winter of 1849, one crate didn't arrive, and the silence that had protected the Walsh family for over a decade began to unravel, slowly, methodically, and with the quiet persistence of the truth. Academic standards, combined with personal and financial pressures, often led students to withdraw. Without notice, he gently reminded Father O'Malley that not all young men were suited for the medical profession, no matter how strong their initial intentions. Father O'Malley nodded politely, but behind his calm demeanor lay the sharp instincts of a seasoned investigator. He requested access to academic records, disciplinary files, and any correspondence related to the missing students. Dr. Walsh obliged, assigning his secretary to assist the priest. For several days, O'Malley worked in the university's record room, poring over documents, cross-referencing timelines, and compiling a list of inconsistencies. The deeper he dug, the more uneasy he became. Several letters supposedly written by the students bore striking similarities in tone and phrasing. Even the handwriting, while varied slightly, carried a consistent rhythm and flourish. Details that might escape the casual reader, but stood out starkly to O'Malley. He began speaking discreetly with staff and students. Most offered little beyond praise for the Walsh family and gratitude for the university. But a janitor named Amos, a quiet, aging black man who had worked at St. Thomas for over 2 decades, provided the first real crack in the wall of silence. Amos spoke hesitantly, his voice barely above a whisper. He recalled the nights, always in winter, when he was told to avoid the east wing. Strange sounds, he said, scraping, dragging like something heavy being moved, and smells sweet and sharp, like something that don't belong. He had seen the special containers once, being loaded by torchlight into carriages bound for the docks, stamped with foreign addresses but no return. O'Malley thanked him and recorded every word. He now had enough to suspect a cover-up, but suspicion was not proof. He needed something irrefutable, something that would unravel the prestige, the wealth, and the reputation the Walsh family had so carefully constructed. That moment came one stormy night in early April, when a violent gust blew open the rotted door of a locked storage cellar beneath the old chapel, one rarely used since a newer church had been built on campus. The smell hit O'Malley first, a heavy rot buried beneath the salt and sawdust. Inside the cellar, beneath stacked crates labeled as teaching equipment, were barrels, 4 of them. With trembling hands, Father O'Malley pried one open. Inside was the preserved body of a young man, his features frozen in a grimace of terror, a rosary still clutched in his fist. The next morning, Father O'Malley left Baltimore quietly, carrying with him notes, copied letters, and the name of every missing boy. What he uncovered would shake the Catholic parishes from Boston to Dublin. But before he could speak, he disappeared. His last known whereabouts? A letter addressed to the Archdiocese of New York, postmarked from Baltimore, never delivered. More directly, the Walsh family used their influence over local law enforcement and university trustees to stall and discredit Father O'Malley's efforts. His access to university records was slowly restricted. Meetings were canceled at the last minute. Letters he sent to church authorities were intercepted before reaching their destination. The air around the university grew colder, not just with the winter, but with the creeping chill of fear. Father O'Malley was no longer welcomed with warm smiles. Whispers followed him through hallways. Students who had once spoken to him openly now averted their eyes or claimed not to remember previous conversations. Something unseen but very real had begun to tighten its grip around him. One night, as the wind howled against the ancient brick walls of St. Thomas, Father O'Malley was awakened by a soft knock on the door of his temporary quarters within the rectory. A pale, trembling student named Daniel Riley stood in the hallway, clutching a worn journal bound in leather. "They told me not to say anything," he whispered, "but I think I'm next." Inside the journal were entries written by another student, Michael Dugan, who had vanished the previous year. The entries described in chilling detail a special mentorship offered by Dr. James Walsh. After Michael had received poor grades, he was taken to the lower levels of a university for private anatomy lessons. The journal ended abruptly with a single line. "Tonight, they said I'd see the human body in ways no student ever has before." That was the last anyone had heard from Michael Dugan. Father O'Malley clutched the journal and knew the Walsh family wasn't just running a corrupt university, they were running a factory of death. And time was running out. What he did not know, what no one would have known, is that by revealing the truth he would soon vanish too, swallowed by the same shadows he had tried to expose. But evil never retreats without a fight. The Walsh family, sensing that their secret was dangerously close to being unearthed, responded with calculated cruelty. Father O'Malley began receiving anonymous letters, ink threats cloaked in holy language warning him that any continued investigation would result in devastating consequences for both his safety and his priesthood. One letter simply read, "God does not protect those who dig too deep." But Father O'Malley, a man of unwavering conviction, pressed forward. The decisive moment came when he demanded to inspect the university's basement facilities, claiming he had reason to believe students were being held against their will. Dr. Michael Walsh refused at first, invoking medical safety concerns and ongoing research protocols. But when Father O'Malley threatened to involve civil authorities, the university relented. On the surface, what followed was not a revelation, but a performance. The priest was guided through sterile, brightly lit rooms, fully equipped laboratories preserved, anatomical samples, medical documentation, all above board. Dr. James Walsh stood beside him the entire time, narrating curriculum, offering European standards as justification for every Jared, specimen, and dissected cadaver. What Father O'Malley wasn't shown, what no visitor had ever seen, was a concealed chamber behind the bookshelf in James Walsh's private office, a hidden lab where the truth was soaked into the floorboard and the screams had long since gone silent. O'Malley left without proof, but his soul carried the weight of everything his eyes couldn't see. He submitted a report to the Catholic authorities in Baltimore. In it, he described the eerily consistent student disappearances, the strange behaviors of the faculty, and the gaps in university records. He strongly urged a formal investigation, but reputation is its own kind of armor, and the Walsh name, respected, praised, protected within the elite Catholic medical circle, deflected every blow. O'Malley's report was quietly filed away, its warnings silenced under ecclesiastical bureaucracy. The darkness had survived, wounded, but not slain. Realizing how close they had come to ruin, the Walsh family adapted with sinister precision. They reduced their yearly body count from 6 to 4. They spread the disappearances further apart, crafting richer cover stories. Some victims were now lured from remote towns, where parental inquiries could be more easily drowned in lies and distance. They planted informants across the community, quiet eyes in pews and classrooms, always watching for whispers of investigation. And they began to diversify their market, connecting with institutions overseas, exploring new regions where laws were looser and cadavers more profitable. By 1815, their network had become international. The business of death, once confined to one university's basement, was now a transatlantic enterprise. The demonstration took place in a specially arranged laboratory filled with the scent of antiseptic and clove oil, carefully designed to overwhelm any trace of decay. Heavy velvet curtains blocked all sunlight, casting the room in a dim, surgical glow. Everything was orchestrated. Every flask, every gloved hand, every whispered explanation from Dr. Walsh. But Dr. Heinrich Zimmerman was not a man easily impressed by theater. Though polite, he watched the procedure with narrowed eyes and an unreadable expression in his mind, ticking silently beneath the surface. He asked detailed questions, many of which James deflected with, vague references to family secrets and trade protections. Still, Zimmerman said nothing until he requested to see the cold storage room where cadavers were kept prior to preparation. It was then that the mask began to slip. The request had not been anticipated. James Walsh hesitated. A pause, so brief it could have gone unnoticed, but to a man like Zimmerman, trained to observe the stillness of corpses and the trembling of nerves, it was enough. He smiled softly, politely, and yet behind the smile was suspicion, growing like mold in a crypt. James led him to a secondary storage room, hastily cleaned and filled with older specimens. The air was sharp with formalin. Zimmerman examined the cadavers with professional detachment, but something gnawed at him. These were not the pristine, pliable bodies he had received. These were shriveled, hardened, common. Where were the exceptional ones? That night, Zimmerman did not return to his boarding house. He took a quiet walk to the campus grounds, eventually positioning himself near the rear of the University's East Wing, where, according to an unguarded whisper from a drunken student, the real work was done. He waited for hours until finally, near midnight, a lantern flickered in the window of Dr. Walsh's office. Then movement. A tall, thin man dragged a wooden cart covered in a canvas sheet across the inner courtyard. The wheels creaked on the cobblestones. Zimmerman held his breath as the man approached a section of the wall. Behind the chapel, pressed a brick and revealed a concealed iron door. It opened without a sound. What Zimmerman saw next would never be spoken of in letters or lectures. He returned his homeland a changed man, quiet, withdrawn, pale even by German standards. The specimens he had once praised were now locked in crates in his basement, never again used in lectures. And though he never accused the Walsh family publicly, his letters to colleagues turned cold. Recommendations ceased. Orders declined. Slowly, word spread through the academic underground that something was wrong at St. Thomas. And yet, the Walsh family endured. They adapted. Again, they always had. For every watchful eye, they planted a blind one. For every whispered dissent, they offered a bribe, a promotion, or a disappearance. The deeper their darkness grew, the more brilliantly their academic accolades shone. But darkness, no matter how carefully contained, leaks. In 1823, a fire broke out in one of the lower levels of the university's West Wing. Officially, it was caused by a gas lamp left unattended. Unofficially, it began in a sealed room behind a false wall, one not listed on any blueprint. 3 students perished in the blaze. Their names were never printed in the universities. Memorials. Only a few charred bones were recovered, and among them, according to a janitor who later disappeared, was the skull of a man who had no record of ever enrolling at the school. The basement of St. Thomas Medical University was far removed from the elegant lecture halls above, its stone walls damp, the air heavy with the acrid scent of chemicals and decay, lit only by flickering oil. Lamps. The room pulsed with a kind of silent menace. Dr. Zimmerman, ever the academic, brought along his leather-bound notebook and a sharpened graphite pencil, expecting to record new anatomical techniques. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was that he wouldn't be leaving the basement alive. Dr. Michael Walsh greeted him with his usual warmth, masking the cold calculation behind his eyes. Few other assistants were present, men Zimmerman didn't recognize, men who said nothing and watched everything. At first, the demonstration seemed ordinary, another elderly cadaver, a discussion of embalming fluids. Scalpels passed hand to hand. But Zimmerman quickly realized something was off. The body on the table had no signs of natural death, and worse, bore a fresh incision that hadn't even begun to set. He frowned, stepped closer. "This man died only hours ago," he muttered. Dr. Walsh didn't respond. Instead, he nodded slightly to one of his assistants. Zimmerman turned too late. The blow to the back of his head was swift and silent. The notebook dropped from his fingers, fluttering, to the damp floor like a wounded bird. The last thing he saw was a flickering lamp casting monstrous shadows against the far wall. By morning, Dr. Zimmerman had vanished. The university issued a brief statement. The German physician had left for Philadelphia unexpectedly. His belongings were shipped back to Heidelberg, minus his notes. No one questioned the story. No one dared. Within weeks, rumors began circulating in the darker corners of Europe's medical community. Some whispered that Zimmerman had uncovered something too vile to name. Others claimed he'd stolen proprietary methods and fled. But the truth was buried with him, buried in a coffin that never reached consecrated ground. And back in Baltimore, the Walsh family's operation resumed with renewed secrecy. Their methods more brutal, their victims more carefully chosen. Yet the legacy of Dr. Zimmerman lingered, a silent specter. In the corridors of St. Thomas, a grim reminder that some questions should never be asked. By Edinburgh faculty as a remarkable specimen of anatomical clarity. No one suspected the truth. No. One knew that the eyes staring back at them, once filled with suspicion and resolve, had once belonged to a man who came searching for justice and instead became another silent chapter in the Walsh family's dark legacy. For 22 years, St. Thomas Medical University had masked its horrors beneath the noble veil of science. To outsiders, it was a beacon of progress in a new land, a symbol of enlightenment in the burgeoning American frontier. But beneath its candlelit halls and anatomy theaters, something else stirred, something cold, something preserved, and something watching. The disappearance of Dr. Zimmerman might have vanished into obscurity, just like the others, if not for a janitor who, in 1841, discovered a small leather-bound ledger behind a loose brick in the basement wall. The contents were a detailed record, names, dates, causes of death, and methods of preservation. The final entry, written in a different hand and dated October 15th, 1820, simply read, Z, administered, resistance minimal, exceptional muscle tone, European quality, insured. The janitor reported the finding, but the university board, comprised of old money and silent partners, quickly dismissed the matter as a forgery. The ledger disappeared within a week. Today, no official records exist of Dr. Zimmerman's visit to Baltimore. His name appears only in a footnote in an 1819 European medical journal, where he writes briefly about the promising preservation work being done in America's Maryland. The Walsh family, their descendants, and the university have all moved on, at least publicly. But if you visit the old wing of St. Thomas, sealed since the fire of 1893, and stand near the rusted doors of the basement laboratory, you may feel it too, the cold, the silence, and the unmistakable sense that someone is still watching, and that perhaps some bodies were never meant to be preserved. That would normally be expected during overseas transport. But what disturbed Dr. Schneider the most were the surgical scars and markings, each one hidden just beneath the skin, invisible unless you looked very closely. These weren't ordinary cadavers. These were once living, breathing students whose bodies had been prepared, not preserved, as if their deaths had been orchestrated specifically for the market. Schneider began comparing these specimens with the names of missing students Mackenzie had gathered. A chilling realization took root. Several bodies bore identifiable birthmarks or rare physical features, described by grieving families. These weren't coincidences. These were matches. Fueled by righteous anger and the quiet ache of old friendship, Mackenzie traveled to Edinburgh, posing as a collector of anatomical specimens. There, in a quiet storeroom thick with the scent of embalming, agents and varnished wood, he found him, a glass case labeled only by an acquisition number held the perfectly preserved remains of Patrick O'Brien. It had taken nearly 4 decades. His friend's face, preserved in waxy stillness, looked almost serene, but the fury that ignited within. Mackenzie would shake the foundations of the medical world. This was no longer about curiosity or personal closure. This was about justice. And what Mackenzie would do next would bring the entire Walsh family empire to its knees. This is just the beginning of the reckoning. Stay with us as we uncover how a grieving doctor exposed one of the most horrifying crimes in American medical history. Imagine you're one of the top scientists in Europe, and suddenly you're handed a perfectly preserved body, no decay, no damage, flawless. Sounds impressive, right? That's what Dr. Wilhelm Schneider thought, until he realized the bodies were too perfect. They didn't rot, not even a little. They didn't smell, and they all came from one place, St. Thomas Medical University in America. So Schneider does what any curious genius would do. He studies them closely, and what he finds shocks him. Pattern number 1. Every single body was preserved better than anything Europe could produce at the time. It was like the Americans had some kind of secret chemical superpower no one else knew about. But how? Pattern number 2. All the bodies were young men, aged 18 to 25. That's right, not old people. Not children, just healthy, prime-age males. And every one of them looked like they were imperfect. shape before death. No gunshot wounds, no sickness, no accidents. Which brings us to pattern number 3, the scariest one of all. As Schneider examined the lungs, he realized something spine-chilling. These men hadn't died naturally. Their bodies screamed one thing, asphyxiation, like someone had taken their breath, with no visible damage, no infections, no diseases, just the signs of someone being silently killed. When Schneider shared this horror with Dr. Thomas Mackenzie, a respected American physician whose best friend had mysteriously vanished from St. Thomas decades earlier, it was like lighting a match in a room full of gasoline. Mackenzie had always felt something was wrong. He had tracked over 40 missing students from the university, all of whom supposedly left, but were never heard from again. And now he had proof. Together, Mackenzie and Schneider launched an all-out investigation. Their target? The Walsh family. These weren't just some creepy school administrators. They were masterminds behind a decades-long medical murder ring, using the university as their cover. Their first move? The shipping records. And what they found? Absolutely insane. Between 1798 and 1834, over 400 preserved bodies have been shipped from St. Thomas to medical institutions all over Europe. 400. That number was impossible for a legitimate school to explain, even if they owned 10 hospitals. And worse, these shipments weren't random. They were part of a massive, organized network that stretched across the continent, all funneling dead, preserved bodies from this one American university. It was a factory of death, hiding in plain sight. Now, with the truth in hand, Mackenzie and Schneider knew what had to be done. They didn't call the cops. They didn't alert the press. They went straight to the source. In the summer of 1834, they showed up at St. Thomas posing as European researchers. They claimed to be studying advanced preservation techniques and asked for a full access tour of the facility. But in reality, they were walking into the lion's den, ready to expose one of the darkest conspiracies in American medical history. You won't believe what happened in this secret basement. Mackenzie and Schneider weren't just walking into a university. They were walking into a trap, and they knew it. Dr. Michael Walsh, head of St. Thomas Medical University, had a plan: eliminate the only 2 men who had uncovered the horrifying secret his family had been hiding for 36 years. But let's rewind, because this story is wild. When Mackenzie and Schneider arrived at St. Thomas, they posed as curious researchers from Europe, asking to witness the university's mysterious advanced preservation techniques. What they really wanted? To get inside the hidden lab where over 156 young men had mysteriously died, with no disease, no wounds, just perfectly preserved corpses. Walsh couldn't refuse. If he said no, civil authorities would come knocking. So he smiled and set the date, July 23rd, 1834. A special demonstration in the university's basement. That night, he promised, all secrets would be revealed. What Walsh didn't know, Mackenzie and Schneider weren't just playing detective. They were playing chess. Brain. They had already handed their findings to the authorities in Philadelphia and Baltimore. They made sure that if they disappeared, people would come looking. And most importantly, they had hidden all the evidence, multiple copies in multiple cities. So even if they were killed, the truth would survive. Now fast forward to that fateful night. The 2 investigators walked into the basement lab, and what they saw was straight out of a nightmare. Rows of dissection tables, surgical tools glistening under low lamps, and behind it all, Dr. James Walsh, flanked by 2 assistants, ready to silence them forever. Walsh moved fast, pulling out a bottle of chloroform, the same deadly chemical he had used to murder dozens of healthy young men, including Mackenzie's former roommate, Patrick O'Brien. But this time, it didn't work, because Mackenzie and Schneider were ready. They pulled weapons. The lab erupted into chaos. Shouts, struggles, a gunshot, and then Dr. James Walsh was dead. The 2 investigators, though injured, had survived. Barely. But that wasn't the end. Their bravery led to the full exposure of the Walsh family's grotesque legacy. The truth was too big to bury now. A reign of terror that lasted 3 decades, finally destroyed. And it all came down to one trap, one basement, and 2 men who refused to stay silent. Is a final act of tragedy wrapped in intellect, masked by piety, and driven by a darkness that festered. Behind the sacred walls of St. Thomas Medical University, the courtroom echoed with the chilling testimonies of students who had narrowly escaped becoming victims. Families of the missing wept openly as they identified names from the university's ledgers. Journalists described the trial as a theater of horror, with illustrations of the dissecting chamber appearing in newspapers from Boston to Berlin. But perhaps the most haunting testimony came from the surviving investigator, Mackenzie, who took the stand with his arm in a sling and a tremor in his voice. He described the moment he and Schneider discovered the preserved heads stored in glass jars, some still bearing the expressions they wore in their final moments. It was as if the souls of the dead had been trapped, he said, each face screaming for justice that never came. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Dr. Michael Walsh and Margaret Walsh were sentenced to death by hanging. Their 2 sons, who had also assisted in the operation, were sentenced to life imprisonment. The university was permanently closed. Its buildings were later demolished, and the land was left to fallow, considered cursed by locals. But even in death, the shadow of the Walsh family lingered. Several European universities quietly removed anatomical collections from display. Rumors spread that institutions in Vienna and Paris had knowingly purchased preserved cadavers from the Walshes, choosing to ignore the signs of foul play for the sake of academic prestige. To this day, no memorial marks the land where St. Thomas once stood. Locals speak in hushed tones of strange lights and whisper voices near the site. Some say that on certain nights, the air itself smells faintly of formaldehyde. And so, the story of St. Thomas Medical University, of intellect turned monstrous, of sanctity desecrated, lives on not just as a dark chapter in medical history, but as a warning that even in the most sacred institutions, evil can find a home if we fail to question, to observe, and above all, to remember. The courtroom was silent until the prosecution dropped the bombshell. Everything the Walsh family had claimed, the mercy killings, the noble sacrifice for science, was a calculated lie. Boom. The evidence? A paper trail of horror. $800,000 in cold, hard profit. 156 innocent students. Names, ages, details, every life cataloged like merchandise. The so-called donations weren't acts of generosity. They were murders. For money, and just when the room thought it couldn't get darker, enter Margaret Walsh. Cold, proud, unshaken. She didn't plead. She preached. To her, they weren't crimes. They were contributions. Each corpse was, in her eyes, a gift to mankind. These boys are immortal, she said with a chilling smile. Through death, they became eternal teachers. But that wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. The prosecution pulled back the curtain on the darkest chapter of St. Thomas Medical University, the victim selection process. They had psychological profiles on every student. Socially isolated? Check. Homesick? Vulnerable? From a poor family? Check, check, check. They didn't just murder at random, they hunted. Imagine this. You're a lonely freshman. You miss home. You feel invisible. And somewhere in the basement of your own university, a faculty member has already decided you're next. Students came forward, terrified. Whispers of screams from the cellar. Rooms students avoided. Professors they feared. One said, I heard dragging noises, like something heavy. I told myself it was my imagination. It wasn't. This wasn't just a school. It was a haunted house wearing a lab coat. And the terror didn't stop at the U.S. border. Across the ocean, in Paris, Edinburgh, London, world-class institutions were rocked to the core. They had unknowingly paid top dollar for cadavers, real people who had been murdered at St. Thomas. They weren't just victims. They were exported, dissected, studied, medical trophies of murder. The fallout? Immediate and brutal. Policy overhauls, investigations, public outrage. Suddenly, every university in Europe had to prove their bodies came from legal sources. No more blind trust. No more anonymous donations. Every cadaver needed a story, a real one. And as for the Walsh family, the trial became an international sensation. Crowds filled the streets. Newspapers screamed headlines. It was no longer just about justice. It was about rewriting the rules of medicine itself. This wasn't a courtroom drama. It was a reckoning. And it all started in a university basement. Anatomical specimens. Cold, preserved, numbered, but not forgotten. As the scandal broke across Europe, prestigious medical institutions scrambled to reckon with the unthinkable behind the polished halls of the University of Edinburgh, the University of Paris, and the Royal College of Surgeons in London. Behind those ancient oak doors were secrets rotting in glass jars, unknown victims, American boys, their flesh harvested in the name of science, their deaths reduced to silent exhibits. Many of these institutions launched immediate internal audits. Some uncovered labels written in fading ink, coded ledgers, initials that matched no one in their archives. The implications were unbearable. Memorial services were held in cold stone chapels. Candles lit for boys whose names were never known, whose bones had become the price of progress. But the horror wasn't just moral, it was financial. When investigators followed the money, they unearthed a fortune soaked in blood. Over 36 years, the Walsh family had made more than $800,000. Trafficking preserved bodies. That's over $25 million today. Not from healing, not from curing, but from selling the dead. Boys turned into currency. The profits were laundered through shipping companies, tucked into estates across Maryland and Virginia, and hidden in vaults in European banks. Silent, untraceable, monstrous. In November 1834, justice arrived. Michael and Margaret Walsh were convicted on all charges. Their crimes had spanned decades. Their victims in the hundreds. On December 15, 1834, they were hanged before a crowd of 3,000 people. Some came for justice, others for spectacle, but all witnessed the end of the most infamous medical murder case in American history. And yet, even after the rope tightened, the nightmare did not end. Families of the victims wept in courtrooms and fields alike. Some had searched for their sons for decades, clinging to hope, praying they'd just run away. The truth brought closure and terror. Some families sued. Others searched through shipping logs and anatomical records, desperate to find their child's final resting place. But most of the bodies were long gone, shipped overseas, dissected, mislabeled, lost. St. Thomas Medical University was shut down permanently, its windows boarded, its lecture halls silenced. Eventually, the building was torn down, the land sold. A farming family moved in, unaware of what lay beneath the soil. But the past has a way of echoing. Locals spoke a strange sound in the night, footsteps on gravel with no source, cries that weren't quite animal or human, lights flickering in empty barns, shadows where no man stood. Whether it was real or merely the weight of history pressing on the mind, no one could say for certain, but few stayed long. The legacy, however, remained. The Walsh case sent shockwaves through medical institutions across the U.S. It forced a painful reckoning with the cost of progress, of what happens when science forgets its soul. From that point forward, laws changed. Regulations were tightened. The dead were given back their dignity. But the memory of those boys, their stolen lives, their mutilated bodies, their silent sacrifice, would forever haunt the anatomy labs of the world. Their blood had taught the world a lesson. Knowledge, when built on cruelty, is a curse. A macabre archive, studied by forensic historians, criminologists, and ethicists for decades to come. The Walsh case, often referred to as the St. Thomas Butchery, did not simply close with the execution of Michael and Margaret Walsh. It left a trail of philosophical unease, a national wound too, grotesque to heal quietly. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, the story echoes in medical ethics, classrooms, and historical journals. The documentation found in the university's basement, fragile pages, soaked in formaldehyde and ink, told a story not just of murder, but of a deeply calculated enterprise. The victims had names, lives, dreams, and yet, in ledger after ledger, they were reduced to units. Male, age 19 to 24, healthy tissue, optimal condition, sold to Vienna. Perhaps the most chilling document found among the records was a handwritten note by Margaret Walsh. Herself, in perfect script, she had written, "The dead do not complain. They serve the living in silence." That single line would become the tragic symbol of the entire case, a slogan etched into stone by a society too shocked to ignore what it had allowed to fester in the shadows of its institutions. St. Thomas Medical University was no longer just a building. It had become a metaphor for unchecked ambition, blind trust, and the horrors that emerge when profit supersedes principle. Though the building was gone, demolished in 1837, local legends refused to let its memory fade. Travelers passing by the farmland reported hearing the sound of soft chanting echoing beneath the soil. Some said they saw lights at night, glowing shapes that resembled dissection tables or blood-slicked, instruments gleaming under moonlight. The family who had purchased the land abandoned it within 5 years, claiming the soil yielded nothing, not even weeds. And so, St. Thomas disappeared from maps, but never from memory. Today, the Walsh archives are preserved under lock and key at the National Museum of Medical History. Few dare to read the original documents. Fewer still can stomach the photographs that accompanied them. But for those who do, one truth becomes unshakable. Behind every great institution, behind every noble, calling, there lies potential for darkness, if left unchecked. And at St. Thomas Medical University, that darkness wore a white coat. As the dust of legal proceedings settled and headlines began to fade, the town surrounding St. Thomas Medical University was left eerily silent. The grand facade of the campus, once a symbol of prestige, now stood as a haunting monument to betrayal. Ivy crept along the cracked brickwork like guilt returning to claim its place, and the windows, long boarded up, reflected nothing but gray skies and forgotten prayers. Local children whispered about the place in hushed voices, daring one another to peer through the iron gates after sundown. Parents, once proud to send their sons to the school, now avoided the road altogether. Even the priests who once led mass in the adjacent chapel hesitated to ring the bell, as if the echo itself might awaken something left behind. But the secrets of St. Thomas were not entirely buried. Years later, during a routine renovation of an old European anatomy museum in Vienna, workers uncovered a locked cabinet sealed behind a false wall. Inside were several perfectly preserved human specimens, labeled not with numbers but with full names, American birthplaces, and dates that traced back to the missing students of St. Thomas. Alongside them were handwritten letters from James Walsh himself, boasting about the quality of the flesh and the purity of the specimens. The find reignited international outrage, and the display was quietly dismantled, yet not destroyed. Some say parts of it were sold privately, kept by collectors of the macabre who valued the rarity more than the morality. The chilling legacy of the Walsh family had not ended. It had simply gone underground. In the years that followed, strange reports began to emerge from former alumni of the university. Doctors, in their twilight years, began confessing strange dreams, visions of the section rooms they couldn't recall, entering, of cold hands guiding their scalpels, and of whispering voices reciting anatomy lessons in the dead of night. Some claimed the preserved cadavers had moved slightly when unattended, others swore they had heard the name Walsh spoken in the silence between breaths during surgery. Psychologists dismissed it as survivor's guilt, but those who had studied at St. Thomas knew better. One former professor, Dr. Emmett Langley, kept a diary in his final days. In it, he wrote about a presence that lingered in the university's surgical theater, a presence that grew stronger the longer he taught. On his last page, written the night before he was found dead of an apparent heart attack, he scrawled, "They weren't teaching us how to heal, they were teaching us how to kill." And I think something learned, something remembered, it's still watching. To this day, no one walks the grounds of St. Thomas after dark. The university remains abandoned, but occasionally, a flicker of light is reported in the upper floors. Some say it's just vagrants. Others believe James Walsh's legacy is not entirely gone, that perhaps something he awakened in his decades of silent butchery still lingers, waiting for the scalpel to rise again. So I ask you again, do you really think everything was revealed? Or are there other places, hidden untouched, where ambition and anatomy still dance in the shadows? If you want more stories like this, true horror wrapped in the skin of history, subscribe now. But beware, some truths never stay buried. Until next time.